For years, XRP wasn't rejected by institutions because of the technology. The technology worked. It settled transactions in seconds. It moved value across borders for fractions of a cent. It operated reliably across thousands of nodes for over a decade without a significant outage. The reason institutions kept XRP at arm's length wasn't a technical judgment. It was a legal one. And specifically, it was the absence of a clear answer to one of the most consequential questions in American financial regulation. Is XRP a security? Because if the answer to that question is yes, then every institution that holds it, trades it, integrates it into a payment product, or recommends it to a client is potentially operating in violation of federal securities law. And no bank's compliance department, no asset manager's legal team, and no payment processor's regulatory affairs office is going to sign off on a product built on an asset with that kind of unresolved legal exposure. The SEC's classification of XRP as a digital commodity may have just changed that calculation in a way that nothing else over the past several years managed to do. To understand what actually happened, you need to be precise about what the SEC did and what it did not do, because precision matters enormously in regulatory contexts, and the gap between what was announced and how it gets interpreted in both directions can be significant. The Securities and Exchange Commission issued a formal interpretive guidance that creates a taxonomy for digital assets and classifies XRP, alongside Bitcoin, Ether, and Solana, as a digital commodity. The guidance defines a digital commodity as an asset whose value derives from its programmatic operation and supply and demand dynamics rather than from expectations of profit generated by the managerial efforts of a third party. That second part of the definition is doing a lot of legal work. The test for whether an asset is a security under U.S. law has historically centered on something called the Howey test, which asks whether investors are putting money into a common enterprise with an expectation of profits derived from the efforts of others. The SEC's guidance is essentially saying that XRP, by their current interpretation, does not meet that test because its value comes from the network's function and market forces rather than from Ripple's ongoing managerial activities. The practical consequence is that primary regulatory oversight for XRP shifts from the SEC to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And that shift has immediate and concrete implications for every institution that was waiting for exactly this kind of clarity before moving forward with XRP integration. The distinction between a security and a commodity under U.S. law is not a technical formality. It is a regulatory framework with entirely different compliance requirements, different licensing regimes, different custody rules, and different legal liability structures. When an asset is classified as a security, the institutions that want to hold it, offer it to clients, or build financial products around it are subject to the full weight of federal securities law, including registration requirements, disclosure obligations, and the litigation exposure that comes with operating in a space where the SEC has active enforcement authority. The legal costs alone of maintaining compliance with securities regulations for a single digital asset can be substantial, and the litigation risk in a space where the regulatory lines were unclear was something that institutional legal departments modeled very conservatively. Commodity classification operates under a different framework entirely. The CFTC oversees commodity markets with a regulatory philosophy that has historically been more focused on preventing fraud and manipulation than on the kind of disclosure and registration requirements that define securities regulation. For institutions, commodity classification means a clearer, more familiar regulatory path. It means that the compliance infrastructure they already maintain for other commodity exposures can potentially be adapted for XRP rather than requiring entirely new legal frameworks to be built from scratch. What was actually holding XRP back from institutional adoption was not a single lawsuit or a single regulatory ruling. It was the accumulated weight of years of legal uncertainty that made it impossible for institutions to make long-term infrastructure decisions around an asset whose fundamental legal status was unresolved. The SEC's lawsuit against Ripple, which began in December 2020, cast a shadow over the entire XRP ecosystem in the United States for years. During that period, major U.S. exchanges delisted XRP trading pairs to avoid regulatory exposure. Institutional custody providers declined to add XRP to their platforms. Payment processors who might have integrated Ripple's on-demand liquidity product for cross-border settlement found it difficult to get internal approval for products built on an asset in active SEC litigation. The irony is that outside the United States, where the regulatory situation was clearer, XRP adoption continued to develop. Ripple expanded its ODL network across international markets. The XRP ledger attracted institutional interest in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, where regulatory frameworks were more defined. The US market, historically the most important capital market in the world and the home of the largest institutional investors, was effectively locked out of XRP infrastructure development for years by a legal uncertainty that the technology itself had nothing to do with. Understanding this history is essential for understanding why the SEC's commodity classification is significant. It is not that XRP suddenly became better technology. It is that the US market became available to XRP in a way it had not been. The immediate practical changes that flow from commodity classification are worth enumerating specifically because they illustrate why this matters to institutions beyond the abstract legal question. Ripple can now integrate XRP into its full suite of institutional products, including cross-border payment corridors, liquidity hubs, and banking integrations, without the legal constraint that any such integration might constitute an unregistered securities offering. That specific legal risk was a genuine barrier to enterprise sales in the US market, and its removal opens institutional conversations that simply could not proceed before. US financial institutions that want to integrate XRP into their payment infrastructure now face a single federal regulatory regime rather than a fragmented combination of state-by-state money transmission licensing and unresolved federal securities questions. That simplification of the compliance landscape accelerates the timeline for enterprise deals because the legal analysis required before any institution can sign a contract involving XRP becomes considerably more straightforward. Custody providers can add XRP to their institutional platforms without navigating the uncertainty of offering custody for an asset that might be a security. And asset managers who want to include XRP in products they offer to clients can do so without the disclosure and registration requirements that would apply to a security. Each of these changes represents a specific institutional barrier that the commodity classification removes or significantly reduces. The partnership activity unfolding around XRP in the context of this regulatory clarity illustrates how institutional capital moves when legal uncertainty is resolved. Mastercard's acquisition of BVNK, a stablecoin payments infrastructure provider that has an existing partnership with Ripple's standard custody and trust entity, is a case study in how large traditional financial institutions are positioning themselves in the blockchain infrastructure space. Standard Custody and Trust is a Ripple-owned entity regulated by the New York Department of Financial Services, meaning it operates under one of the most rigorous state financial regulatory frameworks in the United States. BVNK had integrated Standard Custody for Rust settlement on the XRP ledger as part of its interbank settlement infrastructure. When Mastercard acquired BVNK, it acquired that integration along with BVNK's position in the stablecoin payments ecosystem. The implication is that Mastercard, one of the two dominant global payment networks, is now connected to XRP ledger infrastructure through the custody and settlement stack that it acquired. It is important to be precise here. This does not mean Mastercard has endorsed XRP or made any commitment to using it at scale. What it means is that the infrastructure connections exist at an institutional level in ways that would have been impossible without the regulatory clarity that the commodity classification provides. Institutional infrastructure decisions of this kind happen quietly, through acquisition and partnership activity, before they become visible in any public announcement about technology adoption. The broader structural shift happening in U.S. financial regulation right now is worth understanding as context because it explains why the SEC's XRP guidance is part of a larger pattern rather than an isolated event. The current regulatory administration has been explicit about its intention to create a coherent taxonomy for digital assets and to develop regulations that allow the crypto industry to operate and grow within the United States rather than being pushed offshore by regulatory uncertainty. The joint agency action between the SEC and CFTC to develop harmonized regulations reflects an acknowledgement that the fragmented approach of the previous several years, in which different agencies applied different and sometimes contradictory frameworks to the same assets, was creating competitive disadvantages for U.S. financial institutions and driving innovation to jurisdictions with clearer rules. The classification of XRP as a commodity is one component of that larger regulatory reorientation. It establishes a principle, namely that assets whose value derives from network function and market dynamics rather than profit expectations from third-party efforts should be regulated as commodities rather than securities. That will have implications beyond XRP for how the entire digital asset space is classified and overseen in the United States. The risks and limitations of the current situation deserve explicit acknowledgement because presenting regulatory guidance as settled law would be misleading in ways that matter for anyone making long-term decisions. What the SEC issued is interpretive guidance. Guidance is not legislation. It represents the current administration's interpretation of how existing laws apply to digital assets, but it can be revised, withdrawn, or reinterpreted by a future administration or a future SEC leadership without requiring congressional action. The history of crypto regulation in the United States includes multiple instances of regulatory approaches that were reversed when administrations changed. The only durable form of regulatory clarity for the digital asset space is congressional legislation that establishes permanent statutory definitions and frameworks, and that legislation has not yet been enacted. The Clarity Act and related legislative efforts are still working through the political process, and their outcomes remain uncertain. This means that the commodity classification of XRP provides meaningful near-term clarity and removes significant near-term barriers to institutional adoption, but it does not represent the kind of permanent regulatory certainty that would allow institutions to make 20-year infrastructure bets without any residual regulatory risk. Institutions building on XRP infrastructure today are still operating in an environment where the regulatory framework could shift, even if the current direction is the most favorable it has been in years. That residual uncertainty is not a reason to dismiss the significance of the current development, but it is a reason to maintain analytical honesty about what has changed and what has not. The real shift that the SEC's commodity classification represents is not a change in XRP's technology, its use cases, or its fundamental value proposition as a settlement and liquidity layer. All of those things were already in place. The shift is in the legal and regulatory environment surrounding XRP, which for years was the primary obstacle to the institutional adoption that the technology's design had always been capable of supporting. A decade of litigation risk, regulatory uncertainty, and the compliance barriers that flowed from that uncertainty compressed the institutional market for XRP infrastructure in the United States to near zero. The commodity classification does not guarantee that adoption will accelerate, that every bank will integrate XRP payment rails, or that the institutional infrastructure build-out will proceed on any particular timeline. Adoption is still a function of business decisions, competitive dynamics, technology integration costs, and market conditions that the regulatory classification does not determine. But it removes the foundational legal barrier that made those business decisions impossible for a very large class of U.S. institutional participants. The real shift may not be that XRP changed. It may be that the system around it finally did.